Hi, my name is Mark Woodward and I work for the Oklahoma Bureau of Narcotics. Welcome to today's presentation. And this video is geared to help professionals all over the state of Oklahoma understand what are some of the drug threats and trends that are happening. This could be very helpful if you're in an education setting wanting to know whether or not your students might be involved in certain types of activities that are growing in popularity among teens. But it could also help you understand what are some of the issues when it comes to drug use in the workplace, regardless of what that environment might be. But even more importantly than helping you professionally, it's to help you personally as a parent, a grandparent, a neighbor, to understand what are some of the drug threats that may be happening right there in your own community, your own backyard. You know, we're all guilty of this. You may know everything that's happening in your workplace, but then you get home after a long day and you park yourself in the Barca Lounger and you binge watch a TV show and you just get lost and don't even realize what might be happening 15 feet down the hallway in your own teenager's bedroom. And so I want this to equip you as a parent as well as a professional to understand the drug trends and some of the threats that are happening. And when it comes to these different types of trends, you know, I like to start out talking about marijuana because I've worked at the Bureau of Narcotics for 25 years and I've gone to schools all over the state and talked to students and even talking to adults. And there seems to be a big gap when it comes to the knowledge about drugs, wanting to separate them into different categories. For example, with marijuana, for years people have said, well, there's marijuana and then there's all the dangerous drugs. In my 25 years, I've seen marijuana wreck more lives than any other drug. Not because of necessarily the physical effects it has on the body, but because of the path that it puts these kids on. You know, I mentor for a lot of groups who are dealing with people in sober living and in treatment and people in recovery. And when I get to talk with them and ask them how they got started on their pathway to addiction, almost exclusively they say it started out when they were teenagers smoking marijuana with their friends. And oftentimes these kids are starting out at 9 and 10 and 11 years old. And what a lot of parents don't understand is today's marijuana is much different than what they may have smoked 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And so when you've got kids today smoking marijuana as potent as it is, by the time these kids who are 9 or 10 are now 15 or 16, they've moved on to something else because it is so powerful and gets a hold of the brain and it just tells them this solves all their problems. But at the same time, they're developing a quicker tolerance to it. And so it can really get a hold of these kids much quicker than marijuana even 5 years ago, let alone back in the 80s or 90s when many parents were in high school. And so that's one of the big things that I do when I go out and do presentations is I have to start breaking down myths before I can get into actually what's happening with drugs. And so I spend a lot of time, one of the biggest myths, talking about marijuana because it is a science today. More than 30 states have legalized it either medically or recreationally, and so they're bringing a lot more science into it and technology. We are able to manipulate these plants much more now than we were even 5 or 10 years ago. And so as they're able to manipulate these plants, you're talking about taking the THC that gets these kids high and taking it from maybe 2 or 3 or 4% back in the 80s to the 90s where we started to see 6 or 7% THC plants, to the early 2000s when we were seeing 10 or 12% coming in from places like Mexico by the drug organizations. And now in some of the legalization states, including Oklahoma, we're now seeing plants that are testing anywhere from 18 to 22 to even 26% THC. And so we've got to get parents to understand that this is much different than the marijuana they smoked. And your kids today, we got to change this attitude that it's, hey, if the worst thing my kid does is smoke a little marijuana, what's the big deal? I really have to stress to parents, they're not smoking what you smoked 15 or 20 years ago. And it's going to get real boring real quick. And the most important thing is it will never be enough for these kids. As I said, if they're smoking marijuana at 9, 10, 11 years old, their brain's going to get a tolerance to it. And pretty soon they're not going to smoke it and get high. They're going to get bored and they're looking for something else. They're getting bored much quicker now because of how strong today's smokable marijuana is. And so what are they moving on to? They're moving on to the concentrates, what they call the oils. And one of the things I want to share with you throughout this presentation is helping you as a parent, as a professional, as a grandparent, a neighbor, understand what is the language that your loved ones are speaking today, especially if you've got a loved one in addiction. To understand what your kids are going through and these trends that they're into, you got to understand their language. So we're talking about things like dabs, wax, and shatter. Many parents wouldn't know what their kids were talking about. A teacher in a hallway, if they heard some of the students talking about oils or wax or shatter, you need to understand what the language is that these kids are speaking. And also, when I say kids, we're not just talking about teenagers. Sometimes we're talking about your kids may be in their 40s or 50s, but you're still having to deal with some of their addiction and some of the fallout from the choices they're making. But wax, dabs, shatter are just some of the common terms for the oil that is extracted from that marijuana plant. Because you can only get so much potency out of the plant before you start getting into other materials that aren't getting them high. But if you can pull that pure THC oil out and then smoke it in things like glass pipes, this oil can be anywhere from 20% to 40% to 80% THC. So again, as a way to compare this, back in the 80s and 90s, we were talking about marijuana that was maybe anywhere from 4 to 10% THC. Now we're in the 90% range with some of these concentrates, these oils that they're extracting through these chemical processes due to the technology today. Oil is also known among kids as 710. You may see that on a notebook. Maybe one of your kids stole a street sign, they're hanging it on the bedroom wall, and you've wondered, what does 710 mean? Well, inverted, that's oil, and that's a way they could text their friends and put 710, and that's a message to their friends that they're interested in getting high on the oils, the marijuana oil. So you need to understand the language. These kids will use what's called a nail. That's this metal rod that you see here. They'll scoop just a small amount of that concentrate or oil or wax out of these containers, which are legal to sell in Oklahoma dispensaries. And oftentimes, just like kids buying beer, getting somebody to go buy beer for them, they'll have an adult go buy this for them at a dispensary with a marijuana card. But these adults or these kids will take that nail, that metal piece, scoop a little piece off, maybe about the size of a pea, and they'll put it in a glass pipe and hit it with a butane torch and get it boiling hot. And then they're just inhaling the vapors. There's no smoke. There's not going to be today this big cloud of smoke like those of you who grew up and saw some Cheech and Chong movies.
Hey man, am I driving okay?
You're not going to walk into your teenager's bedroom and out comes this rolling smoke.
I think we're parked, man.
But these are called nails. It's called wax, dab, shatter, oil, 710. If you're not certain about some sort of terminology that maybe you heard a student or your own child talking about or saw in a text message, again, feel free to give us a call at the Bureau of Narcotics and we can find out for you and get you an answer. But these are just some of the more common terms for it. And again, they're not done there. They're eventually going to get a tolerance to the oils, and so the next generation are now called diamonds. And what is a diamond? This is the pure THCA. Chemically, it's the same thing, but it is like marijuana on steroids. It is even stronger than that. And I'm going to give you an example. There's a gentleman that I've known for a few years who's a big marijuana advocate, and he is somebody who has smoked for a long time, and his tolerance is very high, and he brags about that. But he said that he went to a competition out in Las Vegas about a year or two ago, and he's pitted up against another contestant, and each one takes a hit of the dabs or the wax or the shatter, and if they're both still standing, then they raise the THC levels and they both take another hit. It's almost like a boxing match, and they have these different rounds until somebody is so high that they pass out or give up. And this guy usually wins these competitions out in Las Vegas. But he said after one of the latest competitions, he went up to a hotel room to party with some of the competitors, and they introduced him to something called diamonds, and it looked like a little, almost a yellowish glass rock. And they handed him a pipe, and they said it's THC diamonds. It's very similar to the oil, so he smoked it, and he said he started having seizures. And this is somebody whose tolerance is so high that he wins most of these national competitions, and even his body could not tolerate how strong THC diamonds are. So my point is this: we've got to change this mentality that there's marijuana and then there's the dangerous drugs that are impacting our kids. Marijuana today is a science of cloning, splicing, cross-pollinating, and changing it to make it stronger and stronger. It's all about the market. There's so many people who've already got a tolerance to the smokable marijuana that there's a huge market for the oils. And now there's more and more people getting a tolerance to the oils, and they need something even stronger than that to get to the same point. And they're moving on to the diamonds. Now, how dangerous can this be? It can also affect the body in other ways. It can create a condition called marijuana psychosis. And it's very similar to somebody being high on PCP. where they can hallucinate. Some of them can be very dark, violent hallucinations. Now, I don't paint with a broad brush. I'm not saying that if your teenager or a coworker goes out and smokes marijuana, they're going to do something violent and crazy. But you also can't paint with a broad brush that marijuana is the harmless drug and we need to focus our attention on the dangerous drugs. A couple of examples here in Oklahoma. This was a Crest parking lot, a grocery store in Edmond, Oklahoma. And we had a 17-year-old kid who was walking through the parking lot, and a woman's pushing her baby and her stroller out to the car in the shopping cart in his car seat, and he just grabbed the baby out of the grocery cart and threw the child to the ground. And this is mom over here picking the child up. He keeps walking, and here he is over here bending a parking lot sign over like it's a soda straw. And the police were called, and they ended up doing a protocol, drawing his blood when he was in custody, thinking it's probably PCP because of the superhuman strength and the violent reaction. But the only drug on board was THC marijuana. Same with a young man, 17 years old, who he and his girlfriend stole some of his uncle's marijuana. And they had been smoking it, and suddenly the young man takes his clothes off, starts acting very strange, breaks into a neighbor's house. The police are called. He's fighting these two police officers, and they ended up having to use deadly force to control this kid. But again, they thought PCP because of the violent reaction. And again, his tox screen came back with only one drug on board, and that was THC. It is part of this psychosis. There was a gentleman who beat up a couple of ER nurses, being very combative in one of the local hospitals. And again, they thought he was also under the influence of PCP, able to break leather restraints. But it was, again, THC was the only drug in his system. It doesn't happen with everybody. But again, as parents, we need to understand, and as co-workers, the things that are going on in our communities, they're not all as harmless as maybe we portray them. And that's why I call the marijuana issue that we're dealing with kind of a Trojan horse, because we as a state and many other states have voted it in. We've welcomed this into our community, but you've got to understand that just like the Trojan horse, there's a dark side to it. And what we have let into our community, there's also the dark side coming out. And so you've got to take the good with the bad, whether it may have medical principles, but it can also have a dark side that people are going to exploit, including your own teenagers. And so we've got to be very, very cognizant. But again, it's all about changing attitudes. We've got to get people to understand that marijuana, there's people that still think it's the Woodstock 2% THC that everybody smoked and danced in the rain. And you're actually talking about a very, very powerful product. It's very similar to alcohol. People may say, well, if the worst thing my kid does is drink a little alcohol at a frat party. Well, you might be talking about Coors Light that's 4.1% alcohol, but what if I said the alcohol at the party was 95% Everclear? Would you still say it's just alcohol? You can't paint with a broad brush. And so you've got to understand what your kids are into when you start finding these signs and signals that your kid may be involved in marijuana. Don't just dismiss it as, hey, we all smoked marijuana in the 80s, what's the big deal? It can be a very big deal today, depending on the child's reaction to it. And again, they can get high in plain sight because these oils, a lot of the e-cigarette and vaping companies are manufacturing their devices to not only be able to vape nicotine oil, but they can also vape the THC oil. And as you know, somebody who's vaping in public, there's very little odor. That's the whole point of e-cigarettes, to cut down on secondhand smoke and other things that are being released. Well, the same holds true for marijuana. They can take the marijuana oil, put it in one of these vape pens, which doesn't look side by side any different than an ink pen, and they can be vaping it right there in class. And while the teacher's got her back turned, or maybe we're talking about one of your coworkers, they can pull that vape pen out of their pocket, hit the oven, and take a quick hit, slip it back into their pocket, and there's no smoke, there's no odor. They're getting high right there in their cubicle at work, or we've seen students at the back of the algebra class texting their friends, going, "I'm totally wasted in algebra class," and their friend is texting back, saying, "Yeah, I'm totally baked here in history," and they're vaping e-cigarettes using e-cigarettes or vapes to get high on the THC oil. They also have devices that Juul and other companies produce that will plug right into your USB of your computer. And if a teacher, for example, or a college professor sees a student with this plugged into their laptop, and they may ask the student, "What is that?" They may say, "Oh, it's a charger, or it's an external hard drive." And if you don't know what it is, they will walk right past it and totally ignore it, and the student could be pulling the cap off and getting a hit as he hides his head behind the keyboard while the teacher's writing something up on the board. And so again, there's people making devices that can make it very easy for people to disguise their drug use in plain sight, whether we're talking about your student or a coworker. And we've been saying for years how dangerous that vaping is, and e-cigarettes, that they're not a safe alternative. You may be trading the nicotine and the tar and the smoke that's harmful for another harmful product, and that can be either the oil that can have different types of agents in it that can corrode the lungs, and you're also putting metals into the body. And so there's a lot of dangers, and over the last over a year or so, we've seen an increase in people ending up in the hospital from vaping THC oil. Some that was purchased illegally and some that was purchased on the black market that ended up having oils that were simply too thick or had cutting agents that really impacted the lungs. And we're talking about young kids in many of these cases. So again, marijuana is not necessarily that safe alternative, that harmless drug that it's being portrayed to be in every case. And of course, anything that comes in a food product or a drinkable, edible product at a store, there's people who make marijuana infused versions of it. So again, these kids don't have to be smoking, and you're not necessarily going to be looking for that cloud of smoke out a car window or a kid's bedroom. One of the things that I tell parents or coworkers, if you're suspicious, one of the things that should raise a red flag is what is their behavior around a seemingly harmless behavior or product. These kids, for example, these THC marijuana infused juices or candies that look just like the real thing. A lot of times these kids will bring them to school, not in the marijuana package, they'll bring it to school in a legitimate package. For example, they'll take the infused THC juices and put them in a Powerade or a Gatorade. Or they'll put the marijuana gummies into a Sour Patch that's legitimate. But if you see a kid or a coworker kind of hiding this nonchalantly, or you find a Gatorade bottle under your kid's mattress hidden in their room, again, a seemingly harmless product like Gatorade would not be hidden under a mattress or being snuck around and quietly passed around in a classroom. So what is the behavior is going to be one of those elephants in the room. Normal kids aren't going to do that. And so we're going to talk about some of those elephants, those things that are right there in plain sight. And you can choose to follow these little trails of breadcrumbs. But a lot of times it's knowing what to look for, and sometimes I've talked to parents who say, I simply don't want to follow them because I don't know what's going to be there. But I'm going to show you what some of these little breadcrumbs are, these little trails that are going to lead to those elephants in the room. And again, a lot of it's their behavior of a student around a seemingly harmless product. If a kid's sitting at the lunch table in the cafeteria at school and he's eating a Rice Krispie treat, but he's taking a teeny tiny little piece, normal kids don't do that. But for THC infused candies, you do have to have a small amount because your reaction can be very, very different from one kid to another. But they're not going to bring them to school in these cannabis packages that are purchased at dispensaries. They'll bring them to school in a sandwich bag. But side by side, you won't be able to tell the difference. So you're not going to be looking at the product. You're going to be looking at a kid's behavior. That's going to be the elephant in the room that you're going to be looking for as a parent. Cheez-Its, caramel corn, Cheetos, is again, everything that comes in a food form or a liquid form at a Walmart, they can make an infused version and sell it online or in a dispensary. It can often make its way to a student's backpack or their bedroom or even a cubicle at work. And of course, with over 300,000 Oklahomans having a medical grow card and a patient card, a lot of these kids aren't having to sneak around. It's already right there in their own home, much like the issue we have with teenagers getting high on their parents' pain medicine. With over 300,000 Oklahomans with a patient card now having marijuana in the house or the oils in the house, these kids don't have to go far. This was just one example. A Claremore girl ended up in the hospital after eating some of the parents' brownies, and she even admitted to police she would help her parents water some of the plants in the house. So again, some of these kids can come to school, and if their behavior looks a little suspicious, start asking questions, because you never know what these kids are into at home. And again, the gummy bears, it's supposed to be medical, but when in doubt, just eat one and wait an hour. We don't know enough about this, and that's the bottom line. So you can't really just make blanket statements that marijuana is all medical, because what could help one person could have a very adverse reaction on somebody else. You can also put the THC in a powder form and put it in inhalers. So you might see a kid sitting on a curb at a park with his feet on a skateboard, shaking up an inhaler and taking a couple of hits from it, and you might think, hey, it's Oklahoma, it's probably an asthma medicine. And it probably is, but it could also be some of the THC powder that's put in these inhalers. So again, another way for kids or coworkers to get high in plain sight. I get a lot of questions about CBD, and there's a big difference between CBD and THC. CBD is non-intoxicating. And it's been used to help people with different types of illnesses, including Dravet syndrome, a severe seizure disorder. And I have a lot of people ask, is it effective? And, you know, I'm not a doctor, but I talk to a lot of doctors, and they say the jury's still out, that some kids do respond for a short period of time, other people don't respond at all, and some say it's just too early to tell. But a lot of them do agree on one thing: it depends on where you get it. If you're buying it from a reputable dealer or you're buying it on the internet, could make all the difference of whether you're getting a potentially good product or you're getting a watered down version of some product. But again, the jury's still out, but there's certainly nothing dangerous that we have ever recognized associated with CBD. But we are concerned because what the voters did approve, as I said before, we're allowing marijuana to be in the house and much easier for these kids to get their hands on. And in Oklahoma, we have one of the most liberal laws in the country. Our law allows for 3 ounces on your person plus 8 ounces in the house. That's the equivalent of 616 half-gram joints or 16 cartons of cigarettes, and that's just for one person. That could be the amount of, this is 3 ounces right here. That's how much a person could have on them. This is Major League Baseball for comparison. And then 3 ounces, 8 ounces would be almost the size of an NFL football. So it's a lot of marijuana to have in the house, and a mom or dad who is a medical card holder is not going to notice if a little bit is missing. And so a lot of kids are showing up to school with marijuana that they have taken from a relative. So you got to keep an eye on it. But we do have a lot of businesses here in our state, actually more than Colorado, California, Oregon, Washington, Alaska, and Nevada combined. So there's a lot of marijuana out there in our state. And the concern is there's so much that there's just not a market for that. And so it starts ending up on the black market. And again, that's another avenue for our teenagers, our kids, our coworkers to get their hands on marijuana. And we're certainly seeing that. This is just Oklahoma County alone. Every one of those green dots is a licensed marijuana grow. And again, this is just Oklahoma County and parts of the surrounding areas. So we've got a lot of marijuana being grown in Oklahoma. And with patients being able to grow their own plants as well, you're going to start seeing them in backyards. This was a shot out of California here, but you can see just in this 2-block area, there's 18 marijuana grows. You've got 18 different people growing it in their backyards, and some of them have swimming pools. There's going to be kids around there, but we also have teenagers who say, I don't want to go buy it on the streets. I can just sneak over the neighbor's fence in the middle of the night and take 1 or 2 plants. And we've seen some adults and kids getting hurt with confrontations with neighbors trying to steal marijuana. And so that's another one of those dark sides of this Trojan horse. We even had a couple of shootings, at least 2 people we've known were killed, caught stealing plants from another grower. So there is a dark side, but it's all about what's going on in the brain. People need to understand why you can't just yell at somebody who's an addict and say quit. You need to understand how the brain's working. And I wish using drugs felt like chewing on broken glass or nails, because if it did, we wouldn't have a drug problem. But drugs are going to release dopamine. That's your pleasure chemical, and it says this feels good. I like this behavior. And so when the brain releases that pleasure chemical and says this feels good, the brain counteracts it by saying, okay, well then let's make sure you never forget the source of that pleasure. And it leaves glutamate back to the center. It's kind of a trail of breadcrumbs reminding your brain what behavior gives them the source of that pleasure. And if they get that pleasure and that connection going, then a little switch goes on. And what you need to understand is there's no way to turn that switch off. Once the brain figures out what it likes, you can't turn that off. People don't go to drug treatment to flip the switch off. You go to drug treatment to learn the tools to fight that switch the rest of your life. Now, the switch doesn't go on with everybody. Some people drink alcohol and they don't like how it tastes and they don't become an alcoholic. Some people take a few oxycodone after heart surgery or a knee surgery and they don't become a full-blown addict because there's no pleasure. They don't get to that point where the switch goes on. But it's when the switch goes on and it figures out, I like this behavior, the brain starts craving it. And that's why if you don't feed that craving, they start getting depressed and anxious. And so you get this cycle going with marijuana. A lot of people say, well, I smoke marijuana because without it, I get anxious or depressed. But the problem is if you don't smoke marijuana, you get anxious or depressed. And so you've got this continuous cycle of being dependent on that drug. And the brain is craving it. But as far as what has a bullseye on it for people, anything that will give a kid a euphoria, energy, a dizziness, lightheaded, drowsy, hallucinator is simply risky. These are things you as a parent need to keep an eye out for your kids doing. A couple of things we know about kids. First of all, they already know everything and we're wasting their time. The second thing is they're 9 feet tall and bulletproof. In fact, the more dangerous you tell a kid something is, the more likely they are to want to try it. I mean, I've seen this experiment before. They put a wet paint sign in the hallway of a high school, and then you just sit back and watch how many kids touch it because they want to see, is it really wet? They want to see, is this stuff really dangerous? Is it that big of a deal? There's a reason that thousands of videos are uploaded every day on YouTube of teenagers doing some of the craziest stuff, because they don't see it as being hurt or a risk, something that could hurt them or kill them. They see this as entertainment. They see this as something that's going to get acceptance from my friend. They're thinking 30-minute increments at a time. In fact, you'll see these kids, you'll have a kid on a 2-story roof in a shopping cart, and his friends are getting ready to push him off, and they all have their phones going. And the last thing the kid says before he gets pushed off that 2nd-story roof is, your videos you're on record, right? I want to make sure that if I die, this gets uploaded to YouTube. They're not thinking that way. They're not thinking in terms of this could hurt me. And here's the other thing. The more risky it is, when they try it, oftentimes there's no consequences because somebody is there in that yard to catch them, literally or figuratively. If the kid gets hurt doing something risky, we oftentimes, pay their medical bills, get them out of the hospital, get them all better. I've had parents who are buying their 3rd car now for their teenager who wrecked it while they had been drinking beer. There weren't consequences. The parents were there to catch them. They were that safety net. They made the bad situation go away. I talk to a lot of addicts in recovery, and I'll ask them, what was it that kept you in your addiction so long? And their number one answer is, I never had to quit. Because people kept fixing my bad behavior. At 3 in the morning when they would get their 5th DUI and they call mom or they call their wife, they race down to the jail with a bail bondsman, they get their husband out of jail, they get their teenager out of jail. And somebody kept catching them. They never had to hit rock bottom to the point where they had to change their behavior. Somebody's always there to catch them. And these kids they understand that somebody's going to make my bad behavior go away. It's not my fault. Whatever I do, something else is to blame, is the mentality that a lot of these kids are clinging to in their decisions, including drug use. They'll say, well, it's medicine. Well, they're doing it. My parents are doing it. It's okay for them. Or I'm doing this bad behavior, but it's because my parents divorced and it's their fault. That's right out of the Addict's Playbook 101, is to blame mom and dad for my choices as an adult child for my whatever behavior it is. That's getting me in trouble. And there's a lot of things that are just in the house already that kids don't have to sneak around to get. Kids have figured out through the internet and through their friends that large doses of anything can give them that energy, dizziness, lightheaded. So Benadryl, NoDoz, NyQuil, there's a lot of things that have alcohol in it and other things. If you just take enough of it, it'll give them that kind of dizzy effect. But certainly that can be dangerous on the liver and toxic in high doses. Just in any grocery store, hardware store paint section, there's over 4,500 products that kids can huff to get that high, that dizziness, that lightheadedness. Some of the elephants in the room are keeping this stuff in the same place in the house. And if it's been moved, ask your spouse. It's one thing to have a can of paint thinner out in the garage. You find a can of paint thinner in your teenager's bedroom, that's time to start asking questions. If you just bought a 6-pack of Dust Off at the big box store last weekend and now there's only 1 can left, nobody's keyboards are that dirty. That is an elephant in the room. Start asking questions. Keep this stuff in the same place in the house. That's a trail of breadcrumbs that something's going on here. You go into your teenager's bedroom and it smells like a typical teenager's bedroom, yet you notice 16 empty cans of Glade under the bed. Mom, that's an elephant in the room. The kids are huffing them. Your kid comes home looking like this and you ask them what happened. They say, oh, there was a horrible explosion in art class today. Well, what's mom's answer? I'm glad you're okay, because my kid wouldn't lie to me. There's some real obvious signs that parents just don't want to ask questions. They don't want to follow some of those breadcrumbs. A tragic example happened a few years ago in Del City. It was around Thanksgiving break, and the family can't find their 14-year-old son. The family is scouring the neighborhood, they're texting, they're calling, and finally, Dad went across the street and was walking behind one of the houses when he noticed his son laying dead next to the neighbor's air conditioning unit. The child had disconnected the Freon line and was huffing the Freon. And several weeks later, Dad was on the home computer and he noticed in the internet history that his son had been watching videos online on how to disconnect and get high using Freon. These kids are leaving a trail of breadcrumbs to their bad behavior if you choose to follow them. You've got to look at those text messages, look at their internet history, look at their behavior, get to know who their friends are and what's the behavior of their friends around what should be a seemingly harmless activity. But watch the internet history. Your kids are going to watch videos, go to websites that are interesting to them. So they're trying to tell you what they're interested in, whether it's games or bicycling or playing football. But if they're watching, most of their videos are things about getting high or huffing or vaping, your kid's into that, and they're trying to tell you that in a nonchalant way. And it's tough enough keeping up with street drugs, but now with the internet and the dark web and technology today, people can create their own drugs. And so it's difficult for us as professionals to catch up on what are the newest drugs on the streets. Oftentimes we won't know until we get an autopsy report or an overdose report from a hospital. We've seen that the last several years with synthetic marijuana known as K2 or Spice. There's synthetic methamphetamine they call bath salts or hookah cleaner, CD head cleaner that they buy online. Synthetic methamphetamine called Flakka. There's even an old drug called DMT or dimethyltryptamine that was big back in the 70s as a hallucinogen. And it kind of died off. It just was unpopular until they came out with an oil form that could be vaped. And suddenly the last several years we've seen an uptick in overdoses involving teenagers vaping DMT. And then some drugs, like I said, we won't know about until we have kids dead from them. This happened a couple of years ago down in Kanawha, Oklahoma. A kid, 19-year-old kid, bought something online that was advertised as legal liquid ecstasy. And he bought it and took it to a party, put it in with a sports drink, I believe. About 31 kids at the party drank it, and 2 kids ended up dead. They thought at first that it was a synthetic club drug called 2CI or 2CE, but it ended up being a drug called 2-bromo-dragonfly. And we'd never heard of it, and we haven't heard of it since here in Oklahoma. But every day there's something new that the kids read about. They hear it's going to be the next big thing. And again, they're not afraid of it. Because again, they're not thinking in those terms. They're thinking of getting popular with their friends, being accepted by their friends, having a good time. Some of these kids simply say, I'm bored. Yeah, again, you got to look at that internet history. And most of us will only use probably 4 to 6% of the internet our entire lives. Most of the surface web, a little bit of the deep web with medical stuff and banking stuff. But these kids, and if you've got teenagers, you've seen them play video games. Even if you have young adults in their 20s, they can do 1,000,000 different levels, 1,000 miles an hour, and remember all the tricks and trades to level up. They're doing the same with leveling down on the internet, to go through these wormholes and ghost servers to figure out how to get to places like the dark web. And that's where kids can buy some of the things like the wax and the dabs and the nails and other things that they can't buy at a dispensary. That's where they can buy bromo dragonfly and DMT and some of these other drugs. They know how to navigate. They're not easy to do. It's hard to get into some of these places. But it's hard to level up in video games, but over time they learn to do it. And once they learn to do it, they share these links with their friends. And so there's probably pockets of kids at every school that know how to navigate parts of the dark web. It's a dangerous place because there's just so much, predators down there, the child pornographers, the human traffickers, certainly the drug organizations do a lot of their communications down there. So we certainly don't want our kids down there, but some of them do know how to navigate down there and get themselves into trouble. And what's scary too, there's a fourth layer. As bad as the dark web is, it's called the Mariana level or the Mariana Trench, and it's everything that's on the dark web, amplified. And even some kids have said they know how to navigate parts of the Mariana level. A lot of these dark sites have what are called POS buttons. That's a parent over shoulder. So parents need to understand, you would think the time that my kid's going to get in trouble is Friday and Saturday night at a party. But the number one window of opportunity for kids to get in trouble is Monday through Friday from 3 to 6. That's when mom and dad are at work and the kids are getting home from school. And a lot of these kids are having friends over, they're on the internet or they're communicating over the internet. And if they're on a site that they shouldn't be on, usually there's a hidden POS button somewhere. So when they hear the garage door open up, oh, dad's home, they just hit that POS button and you walk through the living room and look at the computer and the kid's on GameStop. Well, it's not really GameStop or it's not Legos.com. It's a fake interactive wallpaper set up by these dark sites. So look at your kid's behavior, as I said before. If he's truly on GameStop and you notice him, but his carotid artery is going 1,000,000 miles an hour and he's sweating and he jumped when you walk through the living room like you scared him, the kid's not going to be that scared if they're doing a simple, harmless process like just navigating on a game page. So again, what is their behavior around a seemingly harmless behavior or product? Look at their phones. Calculators, for example. They have these ghost vaults where kids can hide their videos they don't want you to see, hide their pictures and links they don't want you to see, and they're hidden right there on their phone in plain sight under things like maps or calculators. We know kids don't use calculators because we've seen their math scores, but maybe your kid has 6 calculators on his phone. Well, these actually work too. You can put 2 + 2 = 4, but you put your code in there, it opens up a vault, and that's how these kids can much more rapidly surf the internet and purchase things, go to sites. And they use money that technically doesn't exist, Venmo, Bitcoin. There's hundreds of online virtual types of currency where these kids aren't leaving a paper trail. So looking at their behavior can be a big, and their internet history can be a big clue of what they're into. Looking at their text messages, and I know I got parents go, no, that's my kid's phone. Well, if the kid bought the phone and he lives under his own roof, that's his phone. If he bought the phone, he's living under your roof, you absolutely have access to it because they're using your internet and your data and your house to potentially facilitate criminal or at least risky behavior. And so absolutely, my son and daughter, when they were teenagers and we got them a phone, I had one rule. Anytime I wanted, I could do this, and they had to hand me their phone. I didn't care about seeing their text messages. I wanted to see their response when I asked to see their phone. That would dictate how much further I went with looking at their emails or texts and things like that. But you've got to look because the kids are trying to tell you what they're into just by some of the things they're doing. Like a pineapple. These kids aren't going to text their friends and say, can you bring me a bag of marijuana? They have their own code. They have their own language. It may not be a verbal language. It could be a code in symbols. There was a movie popular a few years ago called The Pineapple Express. And so people started using a pineapple as a way to text their friends, and that would be enough to let them know they want to go get high or they want some marijuana. I would love to print off an entire dictionary that has all the kids' language and print it off, but it changes from one school to the next, and when one clique of friends to the next, they all have their own language. They may send them a rocket ship that says, I want to get high. Again, look at their behavior. Your kid leaves his phone on the island in the kitchen and it goes off and you look down and see a pineapple. Ask your kid, what does a pineapple mean? Could be something simple. He says, oh, that's Rick. He's reminding me I need to bring that pineapple from the refrigerator for home ec class today. Simple, no lie. He's able to rattle off a pretty quick, easy story there. But a lot of times they'll say, well, that pineapple, I mean, you can tell when your kid's kind of stumbling and fumbling, trying to make up a story, and then they get defensive. They say, well, you need to put my phone down, Mom. That's none of your business. What did they just do? They put it back on you. That's page 2, right out of the addict's playbook. First of all, you blame everybody else, and then you become defensive and throw it back on them. So look at those texts. And again, some of the codes they speak in. I don't know if any of y'all have had a chance to read that or decipher it yet, but it's CTN. It's can't talk now, parent over shoulder, talk dirty to me later, Kay. This was a 13-year-old girl having a conversation with a 52-year-old man. The parents would have no clue if they found that on their text message, her phone. Look at the apps they have. There's a lot of apps out there that are made for people who are involved in criminal activity to get rid of them and make them almost impossible, not completely, but almost impossible to retrieve. Even law enforcement have difficult times with things like wicker apps. A lot of the criminal organizations, including drug cartels, human traffickers, they use things like WhatsApp to facilitate their drug use and their drug conversations. Not something a 13-year-old should have on their phone. If your 13-year-old's got wicker apps and using WhatsApp, then you need to start asking some questions. So look at the apps that are on their phones. Look at the games they play. There's millions of free games, and yet what does your kid have on his phone? Oh, your 12-year-old's got Hempire, Weed Boss, Weed Farm. Guess what your kid's doing? He's telling you what he's into. These interest him. He may not be a full-blown drug addict yet, but at 12 years old, you can see the path he's on. Again, look at the apps that are on your kid's phone. They're trying to tell you they're leaving a trail of breadcrumbs. And some of them, it's not just an elephant in the room. The elephant is sitting on mom's chest, and she still doesn't pay attention to it. This is a 16-year-old girl in Tulsa putting 2 bags of marijuana on her Facebook page. She's not even trying to hide it from her parents. There's such a situation going on in her family that she's at the point where this is a cry for help, and she doesn't realize it yet. It took us about 10 minutes to find her. She's bawling her eyes out, crying, saying, I'm so sorry, I got rid of it, I deleted the picture. And we had to tell her, no, you didn't delete it. As soon as you hit share, it's now permanent history that belongs to the internet. Plus, it could be on every job application she ever follows. When a company or a college does a scholarship check and they're looking at backgrounds and photos and social media checks, these kids are putting themselves in a really tough situation just trying to impress their friends. And so again, look at your kid's social media page. That could tell you a lot about what they're into. As I said before, that number one window of opportunity for kids to get into trouble is at 3 to 6. And while some of those kids are coming over to the house, again, they're not having to go very far to get the drug of choice. That's why over the last 12 to 15 years, we've seen such a spike in teen drug use, and those drugs, the number one category of increase is prescription painkillers and anti-anxiety drugs. And the number one place the kids say they get it are right out of the medicine cabinets and purses of parents. You've got to keep an eye on it. Most of us will never have cocaine, meth, or heroin in our house, but any one of us could fall down a flight of stairs and leave the hospital tonight with one of the most powerful drugs on the planet, the oxycodone, hydrocodone, and we're leaving that in unlocked medicine cabinets. We're leaving it on our nightstands or your dresser drawers, where kids or an adult in your family with an addiction has easy access to it. So safeguard the medicine if you need it, and if you don't need it anymore, get rid of it. OBN has put 188 drug disposal boxes in law enforcement lobbies around the state. While you're driving the kids to school, while you're on your way to work, bag up that medicine you don't need anymore and throw it into one of these boxes in our law enforcement lobbies, no questions asked. Don't live with the guilt of knowing that maybe one of your teenagers or even your 37-year-old son-in-law overdosed and died from something they stole out of your cabinet that you should have thrown away years ago. So really keep an eye on those medicines, especially if you have a loved one who's in addiction and you've just recently gotten out of the hospital and you've got pain medicine. You've got to keep an eye on it, because I promise you they will be coming to visit because they see a new source to supply their needs. So really keep an eye out on the medicine that you have in your house. Keep it with you, keep it locked up. If at all possible. And don't advertise to the world that you've got this in your house. Bless their hearts, these are some friend of ours from church. He broke his wrist, and his wife put on Facebook, hydrocodone didn't touch his pain, back to the ER for stronger meds. I think the oxy's working. Why didn't she just put PS the back door's unlocked? And you may be thinking, well, I don't have any friends that would worry about stealing my medicine. You'd be shocked at who the prescription drug addicts are in your community. They're police officers, they're doctors, they're soldiers, they're bus drivers, they're pastors of your church. Many people who've never used illegal drugs, but they get put on pain medicine, and for some of them it can absolutely take over. So you've got to be really, really careful. Don't advertise to the world what you've got inside your house. And another danger that we're dealing with now is fentanyl. Heroin's growing in popularity because there's a lot of people who are getting cut off by their doctors, but now they're opioid addicts from painkillers, so they're going out on the streets and they've been getting heroin. We've seen a huge increase in that for the last 10 years. But now the drug organizations are changing the game. They're now getting a cheaper synthetic opiate called fentanyl that they're mass producing, and in some cases they press it to look just like U.S. pharmaceuticals, or they press it into bricks that look just like heroin. And so it can look just like it, but be 1,000 or 10,000 times stronger. For an example, what I'm talking about, this is carfentanil, and this would be the same dose as this amount of heroin here. And actually, if you cut that into 30 seconds, which you could hardly see, that could be a lethal amount of carfentanil or omefentanil or remifentanil. But even a lot of the manufacturers who are making this stuff overseas don't realize just how powerful of a version of fentanyl they have made. And you won't know until it hits the street. We've been fortunate in Oklahoma. We haven't seen a lot of these clusters like other states, but Cincinnati, for example, 32 heroin overdoses in one day. In places like Atlanta, they had 47. You can always tell when a new batch of heroin has hit the street that's been cut with this cheaper, powerful fentanyl. You start to see a spike in overdoses and deaths. And so again, side by side, you won't be able to tell the difference because they'll press this fentanyl to look just like oxycodone. And we've been dealing in the last couple of years a lot of increase, quite a bit in overdose deaths from people who thought they were out on the streets buying oxycodone, and it ended up being pure fentanyl. This was sold on the streets as black tar heroin, looks just like it, but this ended up testing positive only for fentanyl. There was no heroin in it. This was sold undercover to some of our guys as a kilo of heroin, and it tested positive for fentanyl only. And then these were sold here in Oklahoma as ecstasy. But all of those pills that tested positive, we seized, tested positive for fentanyl only. So you can't always tell the difference. Another trend that we've seen, and it was kind of interest with the popularity of the TV show Breaking Bad. People had asked me, is there really such a thing as blue meth in Oklahoma or anywhere? And I said, no, that it's really not a common thing. Like, it's a TV show, but could you dye it to make it look blue? Yes. And we actually had some people here in Oklahoma do that, and it makes sense why they did it here in a second. This was a little girl. She wrote her father, who's in jail down in Pottawatomie County, and it says, "Hi, Daddy, I love you, I miss you, I drew you a picture, I hope you like it." And it's a little girl with Daddy in the sunshine. And it turns out that Mom had used liquid blue methamphetamine as the ink and had the 4-year-old write this letter and drew the picture to Dad as a way to smuggle the meth into the county jail. So again, parents of the year there, using their child to support his addiction while he's behind bars. If you've got kids into athletics and bodybuilding, that's awesome. But this is one of those don't ask, don't tell dark secrets that we're seeing more problems with than get publicized. You've got kids today who are under so much pressure to be bigger, taller, stronger, and faster than the guy they're lining up against. And this pressure's coming from parents, it's coming from coaches, and it's coming from other kids. And so there's no shortage of websites on the dark web and gyms, even here in Oklahoma City or Tulsa, that there's a go-to guy who knows how to get black market steroids. So watch your kid. One of the elephants in the room is your kid's getting bigger and bigger, but they don't seem to spend any more time in the gym. I've talked to coaches who say, I got 2 or 3 kids on my team that are way too big for our strength and conditioning, but I don't want to know, because guess what? We're winning state championships. I got parents who say, yeah, Billy's getting pretty big over the summer, and he doesn't seem to be working out at the gym anymore. He might be getting some help, but I don't want to know, because guess what? Everybody in college wants him to come play ball for them. So again, it's kind of the don't ask, don't tell, but really watch for it, because they can trade a little bit of glory for a lifetime of health problems from these steroids that are being moved on the dark web and also through our gyms. But they can eat, drink, snort, shoot, or smoke every drug in the book. The most popular ways are shooting or smoking, because they need it and they need it quick. And at first they're getting high, that dopamine's going, but as I said earlier, your brain's going to adjust and it's never going to be enough. This, what we call normal, keeps getting higher and higher, and the high is getting less and less as the body adjusts, till over time, these loved ones that are used to be partying and just having a good time, they're now using drugs just to get out of the pain. They call it dope sick. It can include vomiting, diarrhea, fever, cramps, shakes, their teeth hurt, suicidal pain, and depression. This is why there's so much crime and violence associated with drug use. A lot of people say, well, they're just hurting, they're not hurting anybody but themselves, leave them alone. Let them have a good time. I get that. Right now they're partying and having a good time. The dopamine's going, the switch is on. But over time, the brain adjusts and they're out of dopamine. The body burns up the dopamine, the body destroys the mechanisms to receive the dopamine. Now they still have to have the drug, but they're not getting the pleasure from it. They're just getting the dope sick if they don't keep using. And that is why we have to deal with so much crime and violence for people who go to some of the sweetest people you've ever met, going to extreme lengths to feed their addiction because of what their body's going through. And of course, there's kids paying a steep price for this. Again, for these people who say drug use is a victimless crime, I sit on the State Drug Endangered Children Advisory Board. 5 out of 6 kids that are coming into the state's foster care system are coming from drug homes, specifically methamphetamine. 72% of the homes we serve drug warrants in, there's no edible food, running water, electricity, but we find kids' toys present, because the typical drug users are 18 to 38. That's a prime age not only to have kids, but to small kids inside these homes. So again, a lot of parents are causing a lot of harm to their kids to feed their addiction. It is such a powerful, powerful thing that you will put everything, including your kids, second to your own addiction because of how powerful it is. They're not bad parents, but they're dealing with a bad addiction that is just more powerful, that pipe, that powder, than those pills, than their ability to fight and fight for their kids. And we've seen some tragic examples and some headlines of kids who ended up dead or hurt because of parents either neglecting the children while they're high, the kids getting hurt while the parents were high and unable to take care of them. Again, think outside the box too when it comes to any type of drug use or any type of bad behavior. Anything that comes in a jar, bottle, can, they make fake versions. So again, your kid or your coworkers could be hiding their drug use or alcohol in plain sight. Water bottles that you can actually drink from, but you can separate them in the middle and they can have a hidden compartment that could have drugs, alcohol. Even a kid could potentially sneak some type of a weapon onto a school campus. But take it a second and third look at some of those things that may be in their room, because some of these can be Altoids, deodorant, toothpaste, things that might normally be in a kid's room. But if it looks a little bit odd, take a second and third look at it. And I have parents who say, well, I don't want to go into my kid's room. That invades their privacy. And you know, again, you go back to this mentality that you do everything you can to keep your kids safe. And it's not their room. It is your room. Unless you're fortunate enough to have one of those teenagers that pays your mortgage, it's actually your room. I was doing a presentation like this one night down at Norman North High School, and I had a parent right in the middle of my presentation stand up, and she started yelling at me and yelling at the Norman North superintendent and the police officer that was there. Her son had overdosed and died from oxycodone, and she felt that the school and police had not done enough to keep her son safe, and she actually stormed out of my presentation. She called and she apologized the next day, and I said, ma'am, I understand. I'd be upset too if I lost a child. But she said, when you do these presentations, would you talk to parents about where kids hide their drugs, because she said where my kid was hiding his drugs, I never would have thought to look. Well, this perked my ears up. I said, where was he hiding them? And she said he was hiding his oxycodone in his matchboxes. I said, how old was your son? And she said, 15. I said, what was he doing with matches in his bedroom? And she said he used those to smoke his marijuana. This kid was leaving a trail of breadcrumbs. But mother had the attitude that it's just marijuana. I don't need to check the room. My kid, I can trust him. The bottom line is these kids are into things that are way beyond their experience, anything that they can handle. And parents are wanting, I believe, wanting the best for their kid. But that may include having to make some hard choices when it comes to going into your kid's room, checking their phone, getting to know more about your kid. Dilated pupils can be a sign. One of those elephants in the room, like they've been to the eye doctor and you know they haven't been to the eye doctor. Stimulants, hallucinogens, inhalants, and cannabis or marijuana can dilate them. Constricted, most likely you're talking about opiates. It could be fentanyl, painkillers, heroin, things along those lines. But take a second and third look at a kid. If you've got a student and he looks a little different, put him next to 2 or 3 other students in that classroom, or a coworker. Everybody under these lights better have the same pupil size. The light will determine that unless there's a chemical inhibiting that from happening. Other signs could be odors or chemical stains. The kids can smell like some of the chemicals that they're around, the marijuana, if they've been handling it in their parents' house, things like that. Back when meth labs were really big in Oklahoma, we would have kids showing up to school and they reeked like paint thinner. And you could always almost tell that the kids got a parent somewhere in the house that's cooking because it will saturate their clothes. I had a kid that come up to me at a school a few years ago after a presentation I did for students, and he just reeked of gasoline. And his question to me was, is huffing gasoline dangerous? And I said, absolutely. It's dangerous for me just smelling the smells on you. And then I talked to the teachers afterwards, and they said, oh, he comes to school smelling like this every day. And that was really troubling. A kid like that has no business being on that school campus. This kid needs some help, but they're allowing him to come to school every day reeking like strong gasoline fumes from huffing him. Other odors could be strong smells of perfume or cologne that they're wearing. That could be to try to hide something, especially if they weren't wearing it when they left the house or for school. So give your kids a big old hug. And I tell parents, you need to be doing that anyway. But you throw your arms around them and give them a big old hug. You can smell the marijuana they've been smoking. You can smell the beer that's on their breath. You might smell all the cologne or perfume they're trying to use to mask odors. I always tell parents, you need to hug your kids anyway. But boy, that can really lead you to some elephants in the room. Same with physical changes, weight gain, weight loss that's unexplainable or quite sudden. It may not be drugs or alcohol, but something is triggering this new behavior or choices these kids are making, and you don't want to ignore them. Same with mood swings. Sure, teenagers or your coworkers could be moody, but how about totally unprovoked mood swings from kids or coworkers who've never done that before? Something is triggering this new behavior. Personality changes. Kids used to be real outgoing. They're involved in sports and church youth group and Cub Scouts, and now they never come out of the house. They never come out of their bedroom. Again, something's triggering that new behavior. Same with school problems. I'm not talking about a kid struggling in math class. I'm talking about a kid who's never struggled. Now he's struggling in every class, hardly goes to turn in his assignments or is skipping school and having problems with the staff at school and getting in fights. Look for those school problems that you've seen suddenly come on that were never there before. The websites, as we talked about, store receipts, text messages, those are going to be very obvious elephants in the room for certain things that you find. Same with violent sketches or music or 420. We talked about the 710 being a symbol or a language or a code to other kids that they're into marijuana oil. Same with 420. That's always been a commonly known symbol for smoking marijuana. So don't just dismiss 420 t-shirts or a 420 street sign that might be in your kid's room. You got a kid drawing a rabbit holding a decapitated head. You say, well, my son, he's just artistic. Your son is psychotic. Okay, this was in the notebook of a 13-year-old boy in Midwest City who hacked up his parents with a machete. Kids often draw, write, listen to music, write music, and express through lyrics, through drawings, how they're feeling. If your kid's never been into dark pictures or dark music before, but suddenly there's very disturbing photos or music they're listening to, start asking questions, find out what is triggering this new behavior. Again, it may not always be drugs or alcohol. It could be bullying. It could be other things going on, depression. But it's time to start asking questions. Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris, the Columbine shooters at Columbine High School, several weeks before they showed up at their school with pipe bombs and guns, one of the kids' fathers found their bag full of explosives and pipe bombs. And the dad's response was, "Be careful, son," because he believed his son when his son said, "We're just going to go out and blow up tree stumps out in the woods." And they actually had blown up some trees in the neighborhood, not out in the woods. And they'd also blown up a locker at school. And again, they kept giving this kid a pass, kept saying, well, he's being bullied, he's the victim here. Again, somebody kept catching him. One of our first publicized school shootings happened back in 1997 down at Pearl, Mississippi High School. A 16-year-old boy named Luke Woodham showed up at a school. He shot 9 classmates and killed 2 of them. 4 weeks before he showed up at the school with a gun, neighbors caught him trying to set dogs on fire in the neighborhood. And what was mom and the police's response? 16-year-old boys do stupid things. We'll have a talk with him. Again, what did mom just do? She just caught him. He didn't have to face consequences. She made it go away. 4 weeks later, he shows up at his school with a gun. And by the way, the morning he went to school with the gun and shot his classmates, before he went to school, he stabbed his mother to death at home. Changes in dress and friends. Get to know who your kid's hanging out with. If he's always hung around with the good kids on the sports team or at the church youth group, and now he's already hanging out with kids who've been known to get in trouble with marijuana and other drugs, that's going to be a big telltale sign of what your kid is into. Get to know who those kids are that your kid hangs out with, and then get to know those parents. And drug testing is also a great option. If you suspect your kid's into drugs, again, parents are going to argue that's a First Amendment and violating my kid's right to privacy. But to me, if the kid's got nothing to hide, a drug test is no big deal. And if it does pop positive, you're able to intervene much earlier than waiting until it becomes one of these darker situations. And then you're saying, I wish I'd bought a $15 test and got a hold of my kid much earlier. And probably the most important slide that I'm going to leave you is this one. At the Bureau of Narcotics, if there's anything that we can do to help you out, whether it's drugs in your neighborhood, you suspect somebody's got drug issues in the office, drugs in the school, or you're simply needing resources, who do I call if we need some help? I've got a loved one who's in addiction, or maybe even a support group for a family member of an addict. Please give us a call and reach out to me. You can also leave anonymous messages. Go to the Oklahoma Bureau of Narcotics Facebook page. Send us a private message. Everyone remains anonymous. Nobody ever knows what we do with our tips and how they were generated. And some of our best cases started out with somebody saying, hey, this phone call's probably nothing, but I wanted you to be aware. And oftentimes it does lead to a situation, especially when we're able to get kids out of a home and get some parents some help that they need. I appreciate you tuning in today. And as I said before, please give us a call at the Bureau of Narcotics if there's anything we can do to help, or follow us on social media. Thank you.